to start today by asking you to do something that might feel a little uncomfortable.
Oh boy, starting right out of the gate.
Yeah, right out of the gate. Look, if you're driving right now, please, for the love of safety, keep your eyes on the road.
Definitely do.
But for everyone else, if you're washing dishes, walking the dog, or just sitting on the train, I want you to close your eyes for a second, just for a moment.
Okay, I'm doing it too.
I want you to conjure up your mental image of Iran, and don't filter it.
Right, no self-censoring.
Exactly. Don't try to be politically correct about it. Just grab the very first JPEG that your brain loads up when I say that word, Iran.
I think for most people in the West, that image is high definition and very, very specific.
It really is. You're probably picturing angry crowds, fists in the air.
The chanting.
The chanting, yeah. You're seeing shadors, that absolute sea of black fabric. You're seeing stern-faced clerics with the gray beards and the turbans. You're picturing this, I don't know, this sepia-toned landscape of religious fervor.
Yeah, a place that is fundamentally the other.
Exactly. A place that is scary and, crucially, a place that feels like it has just always been this way.
And that right there, that assumption of always, is exactly where we have to hit the brakes today.
Because it's a myth, isn't it?
It is. That belief, the idea that Iran is just naturally a place of angry theocracy, it isn't a product of history. It isn't a product of fact.
Yeah.
It's a product of repetition.
It's the result of us seeing the exact same news clips on a loop for, what, 40 years now?
Pretty much. And today's deep dive is really going to shatter that image. We are looking at a fascinating and, frankly, quite chilling breakdown by Chase Hughes.
Which is just an incredible source.
Truly. The core argument here is going to make you rethink not just the Middle East, but honestly, how human societies work in general.
The central argument is that the Iran we see today is not an evolution. It wasn't some natural cultural progression where the people gathered around and decided, hey, you know what, we want to live in a theocratic police state.
Right. Nobody votes for that.
Nobody. It was a hijacking.
A psychological hijacking. That is the key term we're going to be unpacking.
And we should clarify, this isn't just a story about geopolitics or religion.
No, not at all. It is a case study on how a modern, educated, secular civilization gets seized. And I use the word seized deliberately here.
Because it implies force.
Exactly. It implies a force acting completely against the will of the host.
Seized is definitely the right word. Because, and this is the part that I found hardest to reconcile with my own mental biases when we started prepping for this, there are people alive right now.
Millions of them.
Yeah. We aren't talking ancient history. We're talking people your parents' age who grew up in Iran wearing Levi's.
Listening to Pink Floyd.
Yes. Going to co-ed universities and falling in love openly in the streets.
And then, in just a blink of an historical eye, they watched their entire reality snap into something entirely unrecognizable.
So our mission today is to unpack exactly how that happens. We're going to look at the lost Iran of the 60s and 70s. Not to be nostalgic, but to understand what was stolen from them.
We have to establish the baseline.
Right. And then we're going to walk through the mechanics of the 1979 takeover, which the source describes as basically a masterclass in psychological operations.
And to do that, we need to discuss a concept Chase Hughes brings up early on in the material. It's actually a survival mechanism.
This was fascinating.
He mentions that when you deploy to the Middle East, or really anywhere under authoritarian rule, you learn one critical distinction if you want to understand the ground truth.
And what's that?
You have to separate the people from the system that cages the people.
Wow. That's a heavy distinction.
It is. But if you miss that, you miss absolutely everything. You start blaming the prisoner for the cage.
Which we do all the time in the West.
All the time. And the chaos we are seeing now in Iran, the protests, the crackdowns, Hughes describes it with this really haunting phrase. He calls it memory colliding with fear.
Memory colliding with fear. I want to put a pin in that because I feel like that is the engine driving everything happening on the streets of Tehran right now.
It absolutely is.
But before we get to the present day, we have to go back to the scene of the crime. Let's talk about the myth of inevitability.
This is where we really have to challenge our own ingrained perceptions.
So let's set the scene. The 1960s, 1970s. If I had a time machine right now and I dropped you into downtown Tehran in, say, 1974, what am I seeing? Am I seeing that sepia-toned religious landscape?
Not even close. You are seeing a city that looks much more like a European capital, think Paris or Madrid, than the caricature of the Middle East we see on the news today.
The source is very specific about the visual details of this.
Very. It was a fundamentally secular society in the public square. It was culturally alive.
When you say culturally alive, give me the tactile details. What does that actually mean for the average person walking down the street?
It means you have a vibrant art scene. You have an Iranian cinema that is being celebrated globally at film festivals. You have rock and roll clubs. But more importantly, you have the structural elements of a modern society. We're talking about women as doctors.
Doctors, lawyers.
Professors, judges, yes. And I really want to pause on that because we often breeze past women's rights as just a quick bullet point in a history book.
Right, like it's just a box to check.
Exactly. But think about the societal infrastructure required to have women serving as judges.
Yeah, that's not a small thing.
Yeah.
You need a legal system that entirely respects their authority over men.
Exactly. For a woman to sit on a bench and pass legal judgment on a man, and for the society to accept it, you need a society that has moved way past patriarchal tribalism.
It's a massive cultural shift.
That isn't a surface-level change. That is deep structural modernity. The universities were world-class.
Right.
Art, music, and science were absolutely thriving.
Which paints such a different picture.
It does, and this is the detail from the source that matters most. This was not a primitive society waiting for a white savior or a religious leader to come along and fix them. They were already there. They were already modern.
That completely destroys the narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I feel like there's this subconscious bias in the West. I mean, I certainly have it, or at least I did before reading this material, that certain parts of the world are just naturally backward.
Yes, the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Exactly. Or that authoritarianism is just their natural expression. Like, oh,
Yeah.
That's just the Middle East.
That is the convenient myth the source talks about extensively. It is very comforting for us in the West to think, oh, well, that's just how that culture is. They like strongmen. They naturally gravitate toward extreme religion.
Because if that's true, we don't have to feel bad about it. We don't have to do anything. It's just their nature.
Exactly. It completely absolves us of having to understand the tragedy. It allows us to intellectually disengage. But when you realize that this was a society that looked very much like ours, educated, ambitious, globally connected, and it was violently turned upside down, it becomes much more frightening.
Right. It stops being a story about them and starts being a very real warning about us.
Precisely. The source frames it as an interruption. It wasn't that the culture slowly evolved into a theocracy over a century. The culture was interrupted. It was seized.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. We're painting this incredibly rosy picture of pre-1979 Iran, disco balls and bell-bottoms and freedom.
Right.
But if it's so great, why did they revolt? The Shah wasn't exactly a saint, was he? I mean, history tells us there was a very real reason millions of people were in the streets in '79.
That's the critical nuance, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because we cannot idealize the past blindly. No, the Shah wasn't a saint, and Hughes is very careful in the material not to paint the Shah as a hero.
Because he was a dictator himself.
Yes. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was backed by Western countries, flush with massive amounts of oil money, but he was undeniably an autocrat.
Okay, so there was legitimate grievance on the ground.
Absolutely legitimate. He had a brutal secret police force, the Savak, that was notorious for torturing political prisoners. There was massive, glaring income inequality.
So it wasn't a utopia.
Far from it. You had the urban elite in North Tehran living literally like Parisians, flying to ski in the Alps. And then you had rural poverty in the provinces that was just crushing. So corruption started to rot the foundations of the country.
Corruption started growing as it always does. That's a direct line from the source.
Right. And when a leader crushes political dissent, when you don't allow people to have a legitimate voice in a democratic process, you create a pressure cooker.
The pressure has to go somewhere.
It does. You create a void where legitimate opposition leadership should be. Because the Shah had decimated the secular opposition, the liberals, the socialists, the student groups. There was almost no one left to lead the opposition except the one group he couldn't fully crush.
The religious network. Because you can't just close all the mosques.
Exactly. And this is exactly where the hijacking begins, because into that massive political void steps Ayatollah Khomeini.
Okay, so here is where it gets really interesting to me from a psychological perspective. Because looking back with our 2020 hindsight today, we see Khomeini as this scowling, bearded face of ultimate religious strictness.
The ultimate villain archetype in Western media.
Right. And we just assume he came in screaming, I'm going to take away your music, I'm going to force women to cover up, and I'm going to ban all fun.
Which, if he had actually done that, the revolution never would have succeeded.
Right. Because who signs up for that? Hey, sign me up for way less freedom in a police state.
Nobody does, and that is the dark brilliance and the horror of the takeover. The source describes Khomeini very specifically as a wolf in sheep's clothing. We need to look at his time in exile before the revolution.
He was living in France, right?
Yes, in Paris, in a suburb called Neauphle-le-Château.
Sitting under an apple tree. I remember that detail.
Literally sitting peacefully under an apple tree, giving polite interviews to the BBC, to French media, to American journalists. And he spoke very softly. He didn't sell himself as a tyrant. He actively wore the costume of a liberator.
So what was the actual sales pitch? If he wasn't selling strict theocracy, what was he selling to the Iranian people?
He was expertly mirroring the people's pain. The people were angry at the Shah's corruption. Khomeini talked about divine justice. The people were angry at American and British interference. Khomeini talked about independence.
Independence. Man, that's a powerful drug for a nation.
It is the ultimate psychological hook. We need to cleanse the corruption. We need to be independent from the puppet masters in the West. We need justice for the poor and oppressed. It was sold entirely as a liberation movement. The source notes that even the communists and the secular intellectuals actively supported him.
Wait, the secular intellectuals supported the religious cleric. They thought he was a vehicle for their own goals.
Exactly. They thought, he's an old, out-of-touch cleric. We'll use his massive grassroots popularity to get rid of the Shah, and then he'll just go back to the mosque and come to study theology, and we'll run the modern country.
Wow. They thought they were hijacking him, but he was actually hijacking them.
Precisely. And this leads to a really profound insight in the source material. Hughes argues that in these types of revolutions, you aren't usually overthrowing the power structure itself. You are simply shifting who is allowed to use violence.
Ooh, who is allowed to use violence? Let's break that down. That feels like a crucial distinction to understand how regimes survive.
Think about the mechanics of it. The Savak, the Shah's secret police, tortured people to protect the monarchy. After the revolution, the Revolutionary Guard tortured people to protect the theocracy. The actual apparatus of control, the dark prisons, the surveillance, the atmosphere of fear, that remains completely intact.
So the machine stays the same?
The only thing that changes is the hand pulling the lever and the ideological justification for pulling it.
So the void that the Shah created by crushing secular democracy, Khomeini just filled it. He didn't dismantle the oppression machine. He just took the keys to it.
He took the keys and he upgraded the engine.
So 1979 happens. The Shah flees. Khomeini flies back in. Is the party over immediately?
Not immediately. And this is the part we so often miss in high school history class. The Islamic Republic didn't just appear overnight like a magic trick. It wasn't like everyone woke up the next Tuesday and put on a veil.
It was a process.
It was a slow, highly methodical consolidation of power.
The classic frog in boiling water scenario.
Very much so. But the heat wasn't just physical violence. The primary weapon, according to the source, wasn't actually religion.
Wait, really? The Islamic Republic's main weapon wasn't religion? That seems completely counterintuitive.
I know. But religion was just the paint on the walls. Fear was the structural foundation of the house. The source emphasizes that the regime used a very specific kind of social fear. It wasn't just the fear of getting a bullet in the head, it was the fear of being an outcast.
The fear of being on the wrong side of history.
Correct. The fear of being socially labeled immoral. Remember, they originally sold this revolution as a moral cleansing. So if you opposed them later, you weren't just a political dissident with a difference of opinion on tax policy. You were immoral. You were unclean. You were an actual enemy of God.
That is so insidious. Because it immediately turns your own neighbors against you. It's no longer just you versus the state. It's you versus society.
Exactly. It turns everyone into a potential enforcer. The source talks a lot about compliance tests.
Let's define that. What exactly is a compliance test in this context?
A compliance test is a public ritual that forces you to submit to the regime's ideology in a highly visible way. The mandatory hijab is the most obvious and powerful example of this.
Okay, let's go there, because this is the absolute flashpoint of the current protests today.
Right. In the early days, right after the revolution, the hijab wasn't mandatory everywhere, but then they started enforcing it step by step. Government buildings first, then everywhere. Why? It's not just about religious modesty, it's about psychological submission.
It's a power play.
Yes. If I can force you to wear something you don't want to wear, Every single time you walk out your front door, you are physically acknowledging my ultimate power over you.
You are basically wearing the flag of the regime on your own body.
Exactly. And if you don't do it, you instantly stand out. You become a visible target. And here is the psychological twist, the really dark part the source highlights. If you are walking down the street and you see a woman without a hijab, and you know the penalty is severe lashes, prison, worse, you might feel fear for her.
Sure, out of empathy.
But you also might feel angered that she is putting you in danger by attracting the morality police to your street corner.
Wow. So the oppressed actually start policing the oppressed. Cover your hair, you're going to get us all in trouble.
That is exactly when the system truly wins. When the citizens enforce the rules on each other just to stay safe, speech became incredibly dangerous. Silence became the only viable survival strategy. And here is the golden rule of PSYOPs that the expert cites directly. Once belief becomes mandatory, truth becomes a liability.
Man, once belief becomes mandatory, truth becomes a liability. That's going to stick with me.
It really should. Because in a system where you must believe, or at least pretend to believe, the official state story stating the obvious, objective truth becomes an act of treason.
And then on top of this massive psychological clampdown, you have the Iran-Iraq War starting right in 1980.
Which hardened absolutely everything. War is the ultimate distraction and the ultimate excuse for domestic repression.
We are under attack.
Exactly. We are at war, so you cannot criticize the government right now. We are at war, so we need more domestic surveillance to catch spies.
It allowed the regime to consolidate their grip on power exponentially faster than they ever could have in peacetime.
And then came the international sanctions, the massive economic strain.
Which just increased the population's reliance on the state. If the state controls the food rations, the fuel, and the jobs, you literally can't afford to rebel. And then you get the complete normalization of surveillance. The source mentioned that people telling on their neighbors just became ordinary daily life. It shattered the basic social trust.
Completely. And this brings us to the generational tragedy of the whole situation. One generation, the parents who actually remembered the freedom of the 70s, they learned exactly what not to say to survive. They learned to heavily self-censor. They created what psychologists call a split self.
A split self. How does that work in practice?
You have the private self, who listens to banned music, drinks alcohol, and curses the mullahs inside the safety of the house with the curtains drawn. And then you have the public self, who wears the dark shador, chants the mandatory slogans at work, and just keeps their head down outside.
And living like that, literally splitting your brain in half for 40 years.
It is exhausting. It is deeply traumatic. It creates a pervasive, constant cognitive dissonance. But the real issue for the regime is the next generation. The kids born in the 90s and 2000s, they grew up entirely inside the cage. They didn't have the lived memory of the before.
Or so the regime thought.
Right.
This is the massive pivot point of the whole deep dive. The cage isn't working anymore. The source makes this fascinating point that the system didn't survive all these decades because people actually believed in it. It survived because people learned to live inside it.
They just learned to navigate the architecture of oppression. The suffering just became normalized.
And the source has this great axiom, that works until it doesn't.
Exactly. And we are very clearly at the doesn't phase now.
So let's talk about what's happening right now. We see the protests. We see Mahsa Amini's tragic death sparking this absolute wildfire across the country. We see the internet blackouts. But the source says, don't look at this as just random chaos or rioting.
Right. Remember the phrase, it's memory colliding with fear.
Explain that mechanism. Because if the younger generation grew up entirely in the cage, what memory do they actually have?
They have what the source calls smuggled memories. This is such a beautiful and honestly heartbreaking concept. These young protesters on the streets are not foreign-backed extremists. They are university students. They are young professionals. They are the direct descendants of that educated modern class from the 70s we talked about earlier.
The ones who wore the jeans and listened to rock music.
Yes. And those parents and grandparents didn't forget. They kept the old photo albums hidden away. They told the stories at the dinner table, quietly, behind closed doors. The source says these memories were basically smuggled through time, filtering down to the kids.
So when a 20-year-old girl in Tehran today looks at a faded photo of her grandmother in 1974, standing in a miniskirt at the university campus, smiling, holding a chemistry textbook,
She realizes instantly that what she is living in right now is not normal. And more importantly, she realizes it is not inevitable. She realizes that something massive was stolen from her before she was even born. It acts as an audit.
An audit, I like that framing.
Yes. If you have no baseline at all, you just accept your reality. If you were born in a concrete room with no windows, you don't even know to miss the sun.
But the photo albums, the smuggled stories, those are the windows. They allow the population to audit their current grim reality against the past and realize we are actively being robbed.
They aren't asking for some radical new revolution. They're just asking for their inheritance back.
Precisely. And that is exactly why the regime is terrified. The expert analysis here is chillingly accurate. When a population remembers itself, suppression becomes extremely hard.
Because you can't gaslight a whole population if they actually have the receipts. You can't tell them, this is how our culture has always been, if they have the family photos proving you wrong.
You can try, but the psychological gap is gone. The physical fear is still there. The bullets from the security forces are very real, but the belief in the system is completely dead. The emperor has no clothes, and the kids are pointing it out on TikTok. And these kids, Gen Z, essentially, they seem fundamentally different from previous protest movements. I see the videos coming out, and they were walking straight up to the heavily armed security forces.
They are. The source points out that they have significantly less to lose than their parents did. The economy is in absolute shambles. They are isolated from the global community. If you look ahead and see absolutely no future, you have no fear.
That's a very dangerous demographic to mess with. Millions of young people with nothing to lose.
And that brings us to the modern battlefield, what the source calls the psyops battlefield. Because the regime isn't just sitting there passively taking it, they are fighting back, but not just with guns and batons.
The source talks about modern psychological tactics, internet shutdowns, narrative fragmentation.
It's information warfare 101. Whenever the protests flare up, the regime immediately pulls the plug on the web.
Why? I mean, obviously to stop him from organizing on Telegram or WhatsApp, but is there a deeper psychological reason for plunging a whole country into digital darkness?
It's about breaking the psychological feedback loop. Protest is highly contagious. Social proof is incredibly powerful. If I see you standing up to a bully, I instantly feel braver. If I see 10,000 people in Azadi Square chanting against the dictator, I realize I am not alone. I realize my hidden private self is actually the vast majority.
So the internet essentially allows the atomized, isolated individuals to finally see themselves as a collective force.
Exactly. So the regime cuts the cord. They want every single protester to feel entirely alone in the dark.
When communication disappears, control increases, but confusion goes through the roof.
And confusion is incredibly useful for an authoritarian regime. If you don't know what's happening just 2 blocks away, you are much less likely to risk your life going out there. Plus, the blackout allows the state media to spread wild rumors. The army is coming. Foreign separatists are attacking the border. It's a CIA plot.
The source mentions that specific tactic, hijacking movements. Hugh says psychological science isn't really designed to manufacture movements, but to hijack them. What does that mean in this context?
This is a really nuanced point. It is very, very hard to invent societal anger from scratch. You can't just walk into a happy, prosperous society and make them riot. The CSA or MI6 can't just snap their fingers and make Iranians hate their government if the government is actually doing a good job.
Okay, that makes sense. The kindling has to be there.
But if there is already massive anger, and in Iran, there's plenty of legitimate anger, you can hijack it, you can redirect it. And the regime itself uses this tactic constantly. They infiltrate the opposition movement.
Like political judo, using their weight against them?
Exactly like judo. You use the opponent's own momentum. You plant agents, provocateurs, people who are secretly paid by the state to be violent, to make the peaceful student protesters look like dangerous terrorists. You have your guys start a fire in a local bank so that the international news cameras film the burning building instead of the peaceful protest signs.
So the regime can get on TV and say, look, we aren't crushing dissent, we are just stopping criminals, they're burning banks, we have to restore public order.
Yes. You completely change the narrative from citizens demanding basic rights to heroic security forces stopping violent rioters. They are constantly trying to fracture the movement from the inside. But the pressure on the regime right now is immense. The source lists the compounding pressures: complete economic collapse, generational defiance, massive elite corruption that everyone can see, and global scrutiny.
It's a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut.
And as the source says, pressure does not guarantee positive change, but pressure always reveals the cracks.
So let's look at those cracks. The source lays out three potential paths forward for Iran. And honestly, looking through these, this is the part that made me the most anxious, because none of them are exactly a walk in the park.
No. Revolutions are rarely clean, and they are rarely quick. And prediction in this specific region is usually a fool's game, but we can look at the structural possibilities based on history.
Let's do it. Path number one, the Iron Fist.
This is the most familiar path. The regime simply hardens.
So just more of the same, but worse.
Much, much worse. We're talking moving toward North Korea levels of isolation. Significantly more repression. More facial recognition surveillance, permanent internet restrictions, creating a complete national intranet where they cut the population off from the global web entirely.
So fear just replaces legitimacy completely.
Yes. At that point, the government isn't even pretending to represent the will of the people anymore. It is simply ruling by brute terror. The source specifically calls this rule by terror.
And the outlook for that, can a modern state actually sustain that indefinitely?
It can work for a while. You can rule a country with a bayonet, as the old political saying goes, but you can't sit on it forever. The source suggests this path makes a country brittle inwardly.
Brittle, meaning it looks terrifyingly strong on the outside, but one solid tap in the right place and it shatters completely.
Exactly. It guarantees a massive future rupture. It just kicks the can down the road, but the can gets heavier and more explosive every time they kick it.
Okay, so that's path one. Path number two. This one sounded, I don't know, deceptively optimistic at first glance. Fracture from within.
It's often called the reformist scenario, but do not mistake it for actual democracy. This is where the system itself splits. You have the elites, the hardline clerics, the Revolutionary Guard generals, and the wealthy insiders. Eventually, some of them start to do the math and realize that the ship is actually sinking.
And they really don't want to drown with the captain.
Exactly. Insiders always fear losing everything, their stolen money, their monopolies, their actual heads, more than they fear moderate change, so they start to quietly negotiate with each other.
Controlled reforms.
Yes. What Hughes calls internal triage. Maybe they officially relax the mandatory dress code. Maybe they throw the morality police under the bus to appease the crowds. Maybe they open up the internet just a bit to get the economy moving. They sacrifice a few highly unpopular hardline policies specifically to save the core regime itself. It's a survival tactic for the elite class.
Right, so it's not actual freedom, but it's a different kind of cage. A slightly bigger cage with better amenities so the prisoners stop shaking the bars.
Correct. The source calls this path realistic but very slow. The country shifts, but carefully and incompletely. It often creates a sort of secular military dictatorship rather than a theocratic one. The generals take over from the clerics.
Still an autocracy, just a different flavor.
Yeah.
And then, path number three, the break point.
The most dangerous, the most unpredictable, and the most rare.
This is the total collapse.
This is where the psychological barrier we talked about earlier, the social fear, collapses completely across the entire society. But there is a very specific mechanism required for this. It doesn't happen just because the student protesters are incredibly brave. Bravery alone isn't enough against heavy machine guns.
Right, history is full of brave people who were just massacred. It happens when the enforcers stop believing.
Yes. When the local police, the Basim militia, the security apparatus, when they stop being willing to use lethal violence against their own neighbors, when the state's monopoly on violence finally fractures.
At that moment, when a riot soldier looks at a crowd of unarmed girls and sees his own sister instead of an enemy of the state.
That is the ultimate tipping point. Look at the sudden fall of the Berlin Wall. Look at Romania in 1989. When the enforcement arm stops believing the narrative, regimes fall incredibly fast, like in a matter of days. It creates a massive power vacuum.
And vacuums are historically very dangerous.
They lead to utter chaos or rebirth, or very often both simultaneously. As the source warns, nobody controls how this ends. It could spiral into a civil war. It could blossom into a messy democracy. It could lead to territorial fragmentation.
It's terrifying and profoundly hopeful at the exact same time.
It is the raw nature of history unfolding.
We've looked at the past, the complex mechanism of the initial takeover, the current collision on the streets, and these three future paths. But I want to circle back to the very end of the source material, because Chase Hughes does something really important here to wrap it up. He zooms out.
He does. He takes the spotlight off Iran for a moment and shines it directly on the rest of us.
He explicitly says this isn't just a warning about Iran or even a warning about religious extremism.
No, It is a universal warning about what happens when stories matter more than people.
Man, that line hit me hard. When stories matter more than people.
When the grand narrative, whether it's the Islamic Revolution or national security or the greater good, becomes more important than the actual human beings living under it, you are in grave danger of being hijacked.
It's a sobering case study of a population slowly losing its ability to say no quietly over time.
That's the boiling frog metaphor again. You don't lose your freedoms all at once in a big dramatic movie scene. You lose them 1 inch at a time. A little bit of self-censorship at work here, a little bit of compliance with a silly new rule there, until one day you wake up and the cage is fully locked.
Identity hijacking.
When a population forgets who they fundamentally are, someone else will happily decide for them. That is the ultimate lesson here. The Iranians didn't just lose their government in 1979, they had their entire cultural identity overwritten by force. They were told by the regime, you are this now. You are a strictly religious, intensely anti-Western, austere people.
And only now, 40-something years later, through these smuggled memories and hidden photos, are they collectively remembering who they really are.
And they are literally fighting and dying to reclaim it.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About our own societal narratives, about the stories we're told by politicians and media about who we are.
The source ends with that exact provocation. Once you truly see the mechanics of psychological hijacking, how social fear is leveraged, how truth becomes a liability, how history is actively rewritten, you stop seeing it as just an Iranian problem.
You start seeing the mechanism everywhere.
You do. You see the early warning signs. And that is the entire point of doing a deep dive like this. It's not just to learn interesting facts about a country far away. It's to sharpen your own eyes, to see the underlying patterns.
So here is the final thought I want to leave you with today. We started this hour by asking you to imagine Iran. Now, I want you to imagine your own society, your own community, your own country.
Think about the narratives you accept.
If the internet went completely dark tomorrow, if a new, supposedly moral story was suddenly sold to you by charismatic leaders that required you to give up just a little bit of your truth to stay safe, would you do it?
And if you did comply, just to get along, would you ever be able to stop?
It's a question heavily worth asking yourself. Huge thanks to the source material, Chase Hughes, for this incredible, eye-opening breakdown. This was a heavy one today, but an incredibly important one.
Absolutely essential reading.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Keep your eyes open. We'll see you next time.
Stay curious.